If you look back in history, you'll find that children have always had an incredibly powerful and undeniable impact on their future. What I mean is that history proves that everything we've learned in this course from Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Cook, and Pastor Ken Graves is 100% true. Their minds, their spirit, and their family relationships have all contributed in powerful ways to shape children's futures. In fact, if we go back to the 1930s, you see that Hitler knew that if he could control the hearts and minds of the children and separate them from their parents, then he could get his evil ideas to spread all throughout Europe and ultimately the world. The forces of evil have been using these principles since the beginning of the world. Technology has changed, but the tactics haven't. Whoever captures the hearts and minds of the children controls the future. I think of that Whitney Houston song, "I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way." But here's the good news. God told us this principle in His Word. That's why He says it's so important that we train up our children in the way they should go, so that when they are old, the future, they'll not depart from it. In this lesson, I sit down with Dr. Marshall Foster, who knows aspects of history better than almost anyone I know. You might remember him from the movie I did called Monumental. And what I love about Marshall is he not only knows his history, but he feels it in the depths of his soul. You'll see just what I'm talking about as he shares with us some unforgettable moments in history and demonstrates how children have been used for both evil and for good. If in fact there really is a spiritual battle that's going on, and it's actually targeting the hearts and minds of kids, then I should be able to look back over history over the last 2,000 years or 5,000 years and say, there it is, there I see it again, I see it again. Bad people see kids as their most valuable commodity.
Well, absolutely. No matter what civilization you go to, you find that children are being misused by the tyrants.
So why would they go after children though, when they're just children, they're weak, they're not the big strong warriors? Why would children be valuable to the forces of evil?
Well, because they know that these children have, they would call it a divine spark in general, we would call it specifically a calling. And if that calling is that they would worship God, they can literally, a small minority of them, can transform the world, can bring liberty and justice and freedom, and can make God's world a beautiful place. You move right through history, and it's through in India and China, it's through the divine right tyrants of the Middle Ages in Europe. Didn't allow the people to read, the young people. No one could read. Everything was in Latin. The Bible was put in Latin and chained to the pulpit. So for 1,000 years, no one could read. And so the result was you had ignorance, and that ignorance bred the ability of the tyrants to control the people. This goes into the 20th century, where we have the greatest century of tyranny the world's ever known, where there are more abused children in the 20th century, 10 times more than in all the history of mankind put together.
Right now.
Right now. And why is that true? Because tyrants, secular tyrant, atheistic tyrants, Adolf Hitler being the ultimate example in the 20th century, rises up in 1933, becomes chancellor, and over the next 6 years through his youth camps is actually able to reprogram a generation of German youth who were trained as Christians and Lutherans by all the way back to Martin Luther in the 16th century. Take the German youth, but they literally were taken at the age of 12 or 14 years old off into these camps, and within 5 years they were the warriors of the Third Reich who went out and killed tens of millions of people and brought the devastation of World War II. Why were they willing to do that in the name of the Fuhrer and kill the Jews and the Christians by the millions and others throughout Europe? Because they had been trained in their youth in what Hitler called the new religion, the new way of life. He said, when people ask, "I won't go with you," he would say, as he said in 1933, "I don't care whether you go with me or not. I own your children. I have the children. And the children of the Third Reich, we will never give them to anyone. They belong to us." So he knew that his strength was in the youth of Germany and giving them a purpose and a goal. And if you give people purpose and a goal, if it's warped and perverted, but it's dominion, which men were created to take dominion, either for good or for evil. You give them a dominion goal. We want nationalism. We want pride. We want to come back and have our nation. And they had been beaten down in World War II, and the Europeans had put them under all these restraints. And so it welled up in the hearts of those youth, and they went out and just killed with gusto. So you see, young people can either be great warriors for good or great warriors for evil, and that was evil. And when Lenin took the Soviet Union, they went in there with a few hundred thugs and were able to take a disrupted Russia and bring it under their control. But they couldn't get the rest of Europe, and they were wondering, why can't we go into Hungary? Why can't we go into Germany? We couldn't get these nations to go, and they realized that they couldn't do it by force, because the Christian people, the Christian farmers of Hungary, when they went into Hungary, within 6 days they were kicked out by the Christian farmers with their pitchfork, and they wouldn't go for the top-down communist philosophy. Why? Because they had been trained as Christians. And so Gramsci said, you must destroy their religion and the character base of what makes these youth willing to die for the state or die for their God. You destroy their God, we will give them a new God, then they will be obedient. And so he realized that he had to take the long march through the institutions. And what he meant by that, and they were very clear, they had to march through education and take control of it. The church, they had to control the seminaries and whitewash the theology. They had to control the media, and they went for the early motion picture industry and into, at that point, radio, which was the big communicative tool. And they went into every form, all forms of media and all institutions, slowly infiltrating. Why? Because they wanted that control to infect the minds. What goes into the eyes and the ears of the youth will determine whether they become world changers for God or terrible butchers who would work for a communist party to wipe out 40 or 50 million in China in the cleansing of the 1970s. Or wipe out 30 or 40 million in Russia under Stalin in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Why would they allow this to happen? Because they've been brainwashed.
It's amazing. It just still blows my mind that 40 million people in China,
Eliminated.
Tens of millions in Europe, that this happened in this century. This happened in the last 100, 150 years.
And they control whether or not you have babies.
This isn't back in Roman days. This isn't back in Egyptian days. This is now.
Right now.
It's amazing to me.
The one child.
It sounds like a movie. It sounds like some crazy conspiracy theory. But just go back to 1933 and look what happened. Go back to the 70s and look what happened. If young people really are the ones who have the ability and the potential and the goods to be able to change the world for good or evil, what are some examples of young people who have really got it right and turned the world upside down for good?
For example, a young child brought up in a Christian home in northern England, southern Scotland in the 5th century. In 405 AD, 1,000 Irish bandits and warriors came for the trafficking. It was called human trafficking. Same thing they do now. They would come in and they would swoop out and take kids from the age of 12 to 18 years old, and they would destroy the city, kill the old people, take the young, put them in the bowels of their ships and take them back to Ireland. So here comes this young guy. He wasn't really a Christian, but he'd been trained by a pastor who was his grandfather, and he knew the Word of God, but he hadn't believed. He ends up being a slave to a guy named Maluk, who has got heads of his enemies up on his palisades and kills up to 40 at a time in these wooden structures, burning them on a Saturday night for a party. This guy puts him in slavery and bondage in Northern Ireland. By the time 6 years go by, he has come to know God, and he's speaking to God, and God says, your ship has come. He runs for his life to the west coast of Ireland where a ship is waiting. Long story short, he gets on the ship, he's able to escape first to France, gets back to England, spends 15 years in preparation, and there while he's preparing to serve God, not knowing what he was going to do, God spoke to him through a vision and dreams of the children of Ireland crying out to him, come, holy boy, come help us. And so Patrick gets on a ship with 12 of his friends.
Wait, this is St. Patrick?
This is St. Patrick. who we talk about as St. Patrick with the mitre, and he looks like he's some kind of a
And we're
holy
thinking
man.
green beer and leprechauns and
no.
four-leaf clover.
He didn't chase any snakes out. He chased a lot of demons out, but he didn't chase any snakes out. There were no snakes.
So he hears the voices, come back to Ireland, and then what does he do?
He goes back into the same slave trading center where he was taken when he was a boy. And he walks from place to place, confronting the kings, leading the children to Christ.
By himself?
By himself with 12 men, no army. These are guys who are headhunters. They literally believe in human sacrifice. They're worshiping druids. It was so bad that even the leaders of the Roman Empire said this is the place where monsters be, and even the Roman generals would not even go to Ireland. It was so bad. He marches in with nobody but 12 friends, wearing nothing but common clothes, and he walks up with such power with the gospel that he's able to see one kingdom after another. These little kingdoms were just nothing more than palisades and warlords. He was able to lead either them to Christ or their youth to Christ and set up over 300 different congregations, which ended up being cities, monasteries, educational centers, where the women and children who were abused all the time were suddenly given a place to learn the scriptures and learn to read. And now, out of the worst place in all of Europe came the foundation of Western civilization. One man, Patrick, comes back, and in 30 years, he has started 300 churches, led over 120,000 people to God, transformed this pagan island into the missionary capital of the world. And for the next 300 years, the Irish missionaries see the conversion of first Scotland, then England, then off to France and to Germany, and bring about the conversion of Europe, the beginning of what we call Christendom, and the concept of the Bible and the truth and education spreading all over the world. And it came through those young children who saw the truth of the gospel, and it was captured in their hearts when they saw this man who had been a slave among them. And that changed the world. He was the first one to speak against slavery that we have seen in writing in the history of the world. He brought an end to slavery, end to trafficking. He brought literacy. He brought great creativity, so that these Irish missionaries to this day go to the farthest most parts of the earth, and you'll find Irish and Scottish missionaries who are giving their lives to change the world. You can go through history. You can see it happen again and again. Let's go into the 19th century. There was a continent, many call the Dark Continent, Africa, that had not been reached, and the tribes were killing one another, and there was all kinds of problems, and the Muslims had trafficking going on down there, and all these things were going on. Nobody was reaching them. And so there was one man in southern Africa named Moffat, Dr. Moffat, and he came to Scotland. And one day he just wanted to preach, to find one other guy to come back with him, because nobody wanted to go to Africa. And he preached in this little church in the middle of winter, and no men came. As he preaches that night to a group of women, there's a boy, 8 years old, doing the bellows of the organ. And after his sermon, he walks out with his books and begins to leave into the snow. And the little boy tags on his back of his coat and says, Dr. Moffat, I heard your message and I'm called. I want to go to Africa with you. And Dr. Moffat says, oh, that's fine, laddie. You follow God's will in your life. And he turned around and walked away, and he realized, I haven't even asked his name. What is your name, son? David Livingston, sir. He went on to train as a minister, but he stuttered so bad that Dr. Moffat said, can you go back to medical school? I need a doctor too. So went back to medical school. So he had both degrees. And at the age of about 25, he took off and joined him, married Dr. Moffat's daughter. He went in and pushed through the Congo, places no one had ever been, for 20 or 30 years, reaching the tribes and reaching the people and loving the people. He saw very little results to begin with for years and years. But he kept going, He brought awareness of it to the people of the world. And soon after him, hundreds and then thousands of missionaries came and began to reach and develop civilization. One little boy who heard the call. You see how important it is when you're young to be sensitive to the call. And that's why reaching people when they're young is so important. Take, for example, the founding of America. Who would think that America was founded not by, swashbuckling armies that came in and founded the country? No. It was founded by a group of separatists who lived in Scrooby, England, and the youngest of them was a young boy who had lost his father and mother and was tempted to go off in and have the summer solstice and play with all the other kids and go into the, sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Sherwood Forest, where he lived. But instead, he went off and joined a church at the age of 13 or 14 years old. His name was William Bradford. William Bradford then was trained by a man named William Brewster, who had started an underground church until King James got wind of it, and so they tried to escape. After a period of a year and a half, the separatists lived in Holland for 10 years. After 10 years, seeing the persecution coming to Holland, they chose to leave again, and they got on a little boat, and the rest is history. It's called the Mayflower. And the man that they chose to be the governor for 30 years, the man who helped set up our Republican government, the man who gave the example of a colony living in freedom and liberty under God, was William Bradford. He went on to live a long, long life. And he said, this one small candle that we have lit has changed, yes, our entire nation. One young person with a vision will change the course of history, even whole continents. And America's here today. And now we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of the landing of that Mayflower. How many people know that it's the young people who capture the vision because they've been trained right in the Word of God? They've been loved by their parents. They've been given the vision that the world can be a better place, that you can have freedom, you can have a godly family. You don't have to have tyrannical government stealing all that you have and putting you in bondage and making you a slave. You can have it all if you'll simply learn from God what to do and follow Him instead of follow the world. When young people know it, they're the ones that change the world. Kirk, you know that. You know, old guys like me, we're on our way out, right? And so we have to prepare the next generation. What does the Word of God say? It says there'll be a blessing to 1,000 generations for those who love me and keep my commandments. Then great civilizations and freedom and liberty sprout all over the world. It's happening now.
You see what I mean about Marshall? I mean, I don't think I've ever met somebody who is so passionate about history. And I love that quote at the end where he said, one young person with a vision can change the course of the world. And it's so true. That's why I wanted to make this course, because it's important to realize that technology is not inherently bad. Technology is not evil. It's a powerful tool, and it can and it must be used for good. Here's what I hope you take away from this lesson. History is filled with examples that prove the fact that children, your children, my children, will change their world. And what they need desperately is parents who are all in for them, in their corner, encouraging, supporting them, leading them to faith in God, and helping them to use the resources of their day to change their world for good.